Welcome back to our podcast. Today we have Ufeli Ani, who's got an interesting background around the whole regulatory and governance environment. And Ufeli, I've seen quite a shift in the regulatory environment over the last little while. For example, there's a number of little startup companies that are looking at creating the framework or the software for regulatory compliance. We know that in general, for an organization, a private corporation, for example, that somewhere between 5 and 8% of expenses can be allocated to regulatory compliance. But when I talk to the software startup companies, they don't really view their software as just simply tracking data or ensuring that the evidence is there of compliance. They see the regulatory environment and corporate governance as an opportunity to create better business models, the opportunity to learn from the data that's in the regulatory compliance database and actually do better and actually use the regulatory environment to create competitive advantage and to create different business models. So it seems to me that's a really interesting shift on the regulatory environment as a cost center to the regulatory environment as perhaps as a strategic advantage. Is that something that you're also seeing in the broader context?
I would say one thing that I've definitely noticed is even as a regulatory compliance professional is seeing the weight that is attached to our opinions as professionals within businesses because we're able to kind of give a perspective that definitely saves the business in multiple ways, and the two major ones, cost and reputation. I would say the regulators aren't like out to get you. It's not a us versus them kind of playing field at all. It's more working with the regulators to ensure that there's a good equal playing field for all to play and make money and serve customers well. And I think if you are able to navigate the abundance of regulation, depending on what environment and industry you work in, of course, but we are in heavily regulated times in general across different industries. And so I think being on top of what's coming out, where your regulator is fixing their priorities for the year ahead and working to that flow is definitely advantageous. It's definitely a strategic point, and I see businesses at the start of the year kind of gathering themselves around their regulators' priorities and making sure that they're ahead of them. So, for example, data protection is a huge one, and I'm sure everyone would have been receiving notifications bit by bit, terms are changing, terms are updating, because nobody wants to be on the wrong side of the regulator in terms of this data privacy issue. And we've seen major corporations fall afoul of this, and I think even smaller players are becoming more and more strategic on we need the data from our customers to create a better service or to get ahead of the competition, but how do we do this with the regulations in mind? How do we stay on the right side of the regulators but still maximize the opportunities out there for us? And so I definitely think this is a strategy point that all good businesses should be rallying around.
One of the situations that we're seeing in some of the countries in the world is actually a reduction in regulations coming forward. But there's an interesting twist that's coming out of the private corporations, and that they're saying that they're already structured for these kind of regulatory environments and see the benefits of these regulations. And even if the regulatory agencies reduce the need for compliance, they say the train has already left the station, that the environmental regulations, the people, the privacy, financial, healthcare, that these regulatory structures are already embedded in the organizations. They already see the value of them. So even if the regulations are removed, they're still going to go ahead and do them. Maybe not have to track as much data, but it's I think an interesting twist that we're seeing that this regulatory benefit is being realized in private corporations, particularly in environments in which they're reducing regulatory compliance. I don't know whether you've seen that as well.
I think it's twofold because I think in one way having a lot of regulation empowers the internal governance officer or the internal compliance officer because you're able to establish good governance because it's required by the regulators and it kind of creates it just permeates through the environment because it's been set as a standard. I think the regulators are kind of aligning their priorities, right? So rather than putting out a huge amount of regulation in just different fields, they're thinking what is actually going to enhance the protection for the consumers here, and then they're going to focus and harness in on those areas. And I would say that I might disagree a little bit to the extent that you're seeing a reduction in regulation and more just a realignment of priorities coming from the regulator as well. And I think it's twofold, like I mentioned before. If these regulations are stripped away, how will internal compliance be in a matter of years? Would it be that corporations may fall into bad habits and record keeping and accountability, or as you say, will the claim hold good that these practices are so deeply embedded now in corporations that we can kind of remove the barriers and we'll still only go this far because that's just what we're used to? And I think we definitely have to be careful because it's taken a while to embed cultures of compliance, and these are reinforced by the regulator. And if the regulator takes their hands off, I think it's only a matter of time before things start to unravel again. And so I think there's definitely a balancing act to be had.
You mentioned the perspective of a regulatory compliance environment on a private corporation from various stakeholder point of views. You talked about customers, and there's investors, there's the employees, and it brings to mind Milton Friedman, who was a famous economist a while back, and he used to argue that all regulation should be removed from the marketplace, and if there were any issues with a corporation, that it would be settled in a civil lawsuit. So, for example, if a pharmaceutical company had to put out a product which harmed people, then that would be settled in a civil lawsuit, and therefore there was no need for the regulatory environment. But as a customer, I'm kind of thinking that if I'm going to travel on an airplane, I want to know that their maintenance schedules are adhering to a regulatory compliance, and that they're just, that this airline and that airline doesn't have different internal standards and there isn't a overall standards. And I heard a quote a while back about the difference between the nuclear industry in the United States versus France, in that in France there's 2 standards for the nuclear industry and hundreds of different kinds of cheese, but in the US it's the exact opposite. So I wonder whether the perspective of regulations is appreciated by all the stakeholders out there, or whether we're still seeing it as a cost center.
Sure, and I would definitely echo your point that, depending on where you stand, it would change your opinion on how relevant and how necessary and how effective regulatory compliance and the regulators are. And like you say, as a customer, if you were to challenge things on a case-by-case basis, or it's only when the pharmaceuticals have caused you damage that you now file a lawsuit, or it's only when the aeroplane falls out of the sky that you now file a lawsuit, those are really extreme cases where the damage has already been done and you're seeking, dollar values to something that may not be remedied by a dollar amount. And I think by having compliance frameworks, by having regulatory frameworks, you're almost putting in place a preventative barrier based on previous experience. So even if the lawsuit still goes ahead, there must be a way to standardize and to entrench these lessons. And I think that's a way that an effective regulator works, is to say, well, these are the risks in this area of business, be it aviation or food, pharmaceuticals. And these are the elements that we think by testing these on a regular basis, we're mitigating those risks. And then good business practice will kind of align themselves with these regulatory principles and therefore, keep the customer happy, but also the profit margins will increase in time because the adaptable businesses find ways to satisfy the regulators, the customers, but also the shareholders and the investors. And I think in ways you're creating a better environment for all because only the really good ones survive.
That brings us back to our earlier point about linking the regulatory compliance and the corporate governance into a strategic framework. So we've talked around the regulatory side. What about the corporate governance? In the average layperson's mind, are they the same thing? Do we think of that our governance structure includes regulatory compliance, or are they really two different kinds of systems?
I think they're two different types of systems but they both serve the function of accountability. It's just who are you being accountable for and on what themes. So regulatory compliance forms a part of corporate governance because essentially you're reporting on how you've protected the business in a number of ways and against a number of different risks and against a number of demands, but to perhaps the investors, the board of directors, and to a select group that have been established to protect the interests of the company. And so I think corporate governance should be separated from regulatory compliance, but they do both serve the purpose of accountability.
And from the data perspective, there is, I imagine, many different data points that have to be gathered. Do you see between the two, the compliance of the regulatory environment plus the governance side, the data has interesting correlations? So if I'm gathering these data points for regulatory compliance, as I mentioned earlier, the RegTech, the regulatory technology companies that are starting to emerge as startups, they're looking at correlations between data points to come up with this interesting change in business models. I wonder if you've also seen that the data gathered has interesting correlations which hasn't been mined or properly had that analytics done on it in the past, but with software we should be able to do that.
Absolutely, and I think that goes back to my earlier point about the adaptable businesses, the agile businesses, the ones who are forward thinking, are the ones who are going to win, because ultimately if the regulators are demanding you keep these records, then why wouldn't you recycle those records? Why wouldn't you review those records and say, okay, well, this is what this exercise has produced, and this is how we can harness the results of those exercises, be it for profit or for idea refinement or just process efficiencies. And I definitely think that these regulatory tech companies are going in the right direction because there's like a byproduct being created that shouldn't be wasted. And I think the companies who are able to harness that byproduct are going to have an edge.
Well, the general premise that the RegTech companies have is one that we're seeing all over the place today, is that anything that generates a large amount of data should have analytics based done on it. And then if the analytics are done on it, it should generate recommendations, not just, cool pie charts and histograms, but it should be able to come out with recommendations to improve. And that's the foundation that these RegTech companies are on, which I'm sure you're well aware of. But so when I look at the regulatory environment and I look at all this massive data, I say, wow, there must be some cool learnings or knowledge that can be extracted from it. So I'd like to wrap up for our listeners there. And I wonder if you have any takeaways for either the practitioners in the regulatory compliance environment, those who are in organizations that have to do compliance, or for people in the academic side, either in the classroom or researching this interesting field, if you have any takeaways for those individuals.
Sure, I would say regulation is important, and you do not want to be on the wrong side of a regulator if you want to last in the current landscape. There's always room for challenging, discussion, policies, sit downs, and to contribute even as a business owner to these regulatory frameworks, even at the consultation stage. And I think those should be taken advantage of. But when it comes to abiding by the guidelines set out by these regulators, I think as an efficient business, you should be working out, well, okay, one, what is the purpose behind this? What is the purpose behind this regulation? And what does that say about the general market? Because remember that the regulators have a broader oversight potentially than you as one business owner. So if the regulators are driving this change and this stream of laws, then what does that say about the general landscape? You should be thinking about that. And then secondly, how can you harness the information that has been generated from complying with these regulations for the purpose that your business exists to meet? And for academics, I think this is a really exciting time because there's so much being documented, there's so much reaction happening, and just being able to again find correlations between, okay, well, this is the old way of doing things, these are the new ways, and what does that mean? And where are the gaps, where are the emerging patterns? And there's so much to study because there's just so much activity happening right now. And so I think both exciting times for either the business owner or the academic, or both.
I find that really interesting that we're speaking about how this data set that's out there can be seen as a driver of strategy in organizations. Certainly lots of research topics for academics because they could come up with whole new strategic approaches if we're entering into an era of where product and price are more or less commodities and we're looking for strategic differentiators.
So yeah, absolutely. I think it's just to wrap up again, it's the kind of taking the time to actually digest, and these are things that a lot of businesses don't have time for because they're just going through the day-to-day motions of business and of doing what they knew how to do when they first started the business. But I think going back to my point, it is very, very essential to review the outcomes of these exercises and see how you can incorporate that into your strategic vision going forward.
Thank you very much for that. Today we were talking to Ufeli Ani about regulatory compliance and the perspective that this has for being a strategic driver in organizations. Thank you for joining us today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for today's podcast. Don't forget to come back again as we talk about another topic. Good day for all and good night.